Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about some of the changes in hip hop that began in 2004 and that sort of continued on into, I don't know what you actually call the decade between the year 2000 and 2010. Or you call that the 2000s, or is that the whole century? And what about the 20 teens? That doesn't sound right. They ought to, who cares? Anyway, so let me give you a background of what was going on in hip hop at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. From the late 80s up and really till the mid 90s, the dominant sound in hip hop was really Dr. Dre's West Coast sound. And it wasn't just Dre. Dre was probably the largest figure in it, but there was Warren G. There was DJ Quick, great producer of that West Coast sound. There were people like Sir Jinx. There were people like DJ Pooh. Battle Cat was around by the mid 90s. A lot of great people all contributing to that West Coast sound. And I've done an entire video on that. But essentially, the West Coast sound was generally a bit less manic than the prevailing sort of New York sound. It was more groovy and and less sort of quick and in your face. There was a lot of lead synthesizer parts. That the sort of Moog synthesizer and others like that. Both Dre and Warren G were pioneering in that. People like Roy Ayers, people like George Clinton featured, people like Isaac Hayes featured heavily in the samples of this. Michael McDonald, famously by Warren G in Regulate. And so it was an altogether more laid back style, but it was much more harmonically intense and much more harmonically sophisticated than what came before it. And it was careful to, instead of do what I call sort of the rapid fire sampling of some of the East Coast stuff, where you might have six different original songs sampled within a 2 to 3 minute track, it let fewer samples build, and increasingly, and this is particularly true in the early 90s with people like Dre and Warren G, instead of just strictly sampling, they would bring in session musicians to faithfully recreate some of the original music, which gave the producer more freedom. And this style sort of conquered the world by the mid 90s. By the mid 90s, everyone was using it. Tupac, who was obviously the leader of the West Coast movement by then, was using it, but it even started to creep into the East Coast sound. People like Biggie and Puffy and all the people that have been on the news for various reasons recently used it. But after the deaths of Biggie and Tupac, there was sort of a void in the hip hop world from both LA and New York, and that tended to be filled by Southern hip hop from places like mainly Atlanta, but Houston was also important. And you've got people like Lil Jon, you've got people like Ludacris, and most importantly, you have the rise of Outkast, who by the early 2000s really conquered the world with their Speaker Box The Love Below album. Absolutely huge. But the late 90s was also the return of Dr. Dre and a sort of semi-updated West Coast sound. A lot more acoustic instruments this time around. And this was the Chronic 2001, as opposed to the Chronic from the early 90s. And this featured the who's who of the Dr. Dre world and the wider West Coast world. And this led to a revival of Ice Cube's West Side Connection, who did some really great work in the early 2000s. And we also saw a kind of what I would call sort of the post East Coast, West Coast gangster rap album of the era, which was 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Trying. 50 obviously from New York, but he was being produced by Dr. Dre and produced also by Eminem, who was a Midwestern white rapper. So by this time, the regions were becoming a bit more blurred compared to the regional differences of the 80s and 90s. And the reasons for this is that, I mean, hip hop began as a very much community driven, community oriented style of music where there might be someone who was the king of a block, let alone a city, because it wasn't a genre that began by the major labels. Oh boy, did they ever seize it and exploit it, but it began as something very community based because it really is all about the personal expression of an individual, a group of individuals through clever lyrics. But by the early 2000s, that had mostly gone. And in some ways it was bad because it took away local and regional distinct identities, but in other ways it was good because it sort of squashed a lot of beefs in the process. And so Get Rich or Die Trying in many ways was the sort of seminal best-selling gangster rap album of the 2000s. But the following year, a very different kind of hip hop album would take the world by storm. And this is the one that was pictured behind me. The artist at the time, known as Kanye West, worked for years to produce this album, and it sounded very different than everything else out there. Again, you had that sort of southern sound that whose most sophisticated iteration were Outkast. You had sort of the post 99 Dr. Dre sound, which was still being listened to. People still were listening to Chronic 2001 in 2004, but things like 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Trying very much still in the charts in 2004. But then this album came around, Kanye West's The College Dropout, and everything about it was different. The sound was more layered, but less aggressive. There was a lot of pitch bending. There was almost a kind of I would in many ways call Kanye's early production style almost like the Phil Spector of hip hop, in that in an age where everything was about either being aggressive or being groovy, he made everything layered. There was so much going on that you almost didn't know what to listen to first. And that, in many ways, is analogous to what Phil Spector did with his Wall of Sound and the pop records of the early 60s. The lyrical content is also different. It isn't sort of insanely fast the way that some of the best East Coast rappers are. It isn't filled with sort of that kind of scathing, biting lyricism like, Jadakiss, one of the best East Coast rappers. It doesn't have a lot of the lingo and a lot of the cultural references of the West, and maybe it's because it was a Midwestern rapper, at least at the time, who created it. But there was just something that was it was more racially on the one hand it was more racially ambiguous, but on the other hand it was a lot more conscious than the stuff that was going on. I mean, he's always sort of walked that line between being someone who's heavily conscious and heavily consciously unconscious conscious. Woo, say that three times fast. So very interesting. And overall, there was something of a very cinematic style where you're sort of invited to listen to the music as though it's telling a semi-ambiguous story, but nevertheless with a clear musical beginning, middle, and end. And this style of production would continue into what we should now, I guess, call him Ye, into his follow-up album, Late Registration, which played on the same theme. And eventually he got sort of tired of sort of the sound that dominated his trilogy of album, Late Registration, Graduation, and of course, the college dropout before that, the one that kicked it all off. And he developed a lot of other sounds in the more recent sort of years. He's been much more into minimalism. Then he started to work a lot more with AI. But this album in particular really changed hip hop. Now, did it change it for the better or for the worse? That is a really interesting question. In some ways, you could say that this album, The College Dropout, made hip hop something that was sort of it made it feel less dangerous. And I think that it was always sort of a bit unfair to call the music dangerous because what that really just means is real. There was a lot of realism in it. In fact, the term gangster rap was invented by the industry. It was originally going to be called reality rap. That was the phrase that the people actually making the music used. But, record labels being what they are, this was, you could call it surreality rap because both the sound, certainly the sound, the production quality was very much surreal. Again, Phil Spector. And the lyrics, again, very different, much more introspective, much more almost, I don't want to say self-deprecating, but bordering on self-deprecation. Very different than the kind of lyrics that we heard before. And eventually, it was this kind of rap that took over the industry. Everyone wanted to collaborate with Kanye. Everyone wanted to sound like this album and its successors. Um, so you could really say that 2004 was sort of this watershed because it was the year that you had the several genres of popular hip hop all colliding. The sort of neo gangster style of 50 Cent, the southern style of Outkast, and this new style that Kanye introduced that ended up by the year 2010 at least becoming that dominant style. A very interesting thing that not a lot of people necessarily, I mean, people in the music world paid attention to it at the time, but in the cultural world that was so otherwise bland, this interesting evolution maybe got overlooked. That's just what I think, though. Let me know what you think. And as always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.